He didn't see the boots. That was his first mistake. Dr. Sterling swept through the pediatric unit of Sacred Heart Hospital in San Diego with the confidence of a man who believed his white coat was armor, his stethoscope was a scepter, and the nurses around him were decorative. He moved down the corridor at 6 in the morning, before the hospital fully woke, before the cafeteria opened, before the day nurses arrived in clusters with their coffee cups and their small talk. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in glass, casting everything in a pale greenish hue that made even the healthy look sick. Megan O'Brien was already 3 hours into her shift. She stood at the medication cart on the 3rd floor, checking vitals on a 7-year-old boy with acute lymphoblastic leukemia, her movements economical and precise. Her badge clipped to her scrubs read M. O'Brien, RN in bureaucratic lettering that told the world nothing. The boy's mother slept in the recliner chair beside his bed, her body folded at uncomfortable angles, her purse clutched against her chest even in sleep. Megan adjusted the foredrip without waking her, her hand steady as a surgical laser, movements that came from somewhere deeper than training, muscle memory from holding people together when everything was coming apart. She had been a registered nurse at Sacred Heart for 4 years. Before that, her employment history was blank. The hospital's background check had stopped short of asking too many questions about the gaps, the redactions, the sealed records. Her references were sparse, 2 names, both deceased. Her previous address was listed as a military facility in San Diego. She had been hired because she worked harder than anyone else, because patients calmed in her presence, because she never asked for time off and never called in sick. No one asked her story. That was exactly how she preferred it. In her locker downstairs, hidden beneath her spare scrubs and tucked behind a stack of surgical caps, sat a pair of combat boots. They were worn through at the heels, the leather cracked in patterns that told stories, dust from 3 continents, blood that would never come completely clean, laces knotted together in a way that made them impossible to untie. She had kept them for 18 years. They had been the last thing she wore before the government told her to disappear. The elevator doors opened at 6:15. Colonel Air Force Mitchell stepped out carrying his 7-year-old daughter Emma. He was a tall man in civilian clothes, dark jeans, a button-down shirt, a wedding ring on his left hand. Emma wore a pink dress with white flowers embroidered along the collar. She was small for her age, thin in a way that spoke of stress rather than illness. Her eyes were open. Her mouth was closed. She had not made a sound since the day a bomb detonated in the Jolan district of Fallujah 6 months earlier, killing 8 Marines and leaving her with a silence that no pediatric neurologist had been able to break. Megan watched from the medication cart as they approached the pediatric unit's reception desk. She didn't turn to look. She didn't need to. She had learned long ago to see the world in its periphery, to process information without appearing to process anything at all. The way Colonel Mitchell's hand rested on his daughter's shoulder, protective but tentative, as if he was afraid she might break if he held too firmly. The way Emma's eyes tracked the movement of a nurse passing by, following the motion but not the person. The particular quality of the silence around that child, the kind that comes from having witnessed something the body understands but the mind cannot articulate. Megan had worn that same silence once. She knew it better than she knew her own name. By 6:30, Dr. Sterling arrived for morning rounds. He was a man in his mid-50s with silver hair swept back from his forehead and the kind of tan that came from a country club, not from outdoor work. His white coat bore the embroidery of his credentials, Dr. Jonathan Sterling, Chief of Pediatrics. His watch cost more than Megan earned in a month. His cologne arrived before he did, a scent like expensive wood and arrogance. The pediatric team assembled in the conference room, 3 residents, 2 interns, for nurses including Megan, and the attending physician who deferred to Dr. Sterling with the practiced ease of someone who had given up arguing years ago. Emma sat in a play area visible through the glass partition, coloring a picture of a butterfly with mechanical precision. Colonel Mitchell sat beside her, watching her hands move the colored pencil across the page with the intensity of a man trying to memorize every detail of his child. Room 312, Dr. Sterling announced, not looking at his notes. He had moved through pediatrics so many times that he didn't need to look. 8-year-old male, all, day 42 of induction therapy. Responding well. No complications. Continue current protocol. One of the residents nodded and made a note. Room 314. 6-year-old female, pneumonia, bacterial, day 5 of antibiotics. Fever trending down. Good response. Discharge by Friday. Another note. Room 318. 7-year-old female, admitted last night, Baghdad trauma case, mother deceased, selective mutism. Dr. Sterling paused. His eyes flicked toward Emma through the glass. Psychiatric evaluation pending. Neurology cleared. Nothing physically wrong. It's psychological. A therapist will be appropriate. Keep her comfortable. Standard pediatric protocols. He moved toward the door. Megan stood against the wall, her hands folded in front of her, her expression blank. She had learned to make herself small in spaces where she was not welcome. She had learned to speak in the language of deference, in the grammar of invisibility. She watched Emma through the glass as Dr. Sterling passed by, watched the child's hand pause mid-motion, the colored pencil hovering above the butterfly's wing. The morning rounds continued. Dr. Sterling moved through the pediatric unit with the efficiency of a man performing a ritual he no longer questioned. His residents followed, their white coats still crisp, their confidence still fragile. Megan moved with them, checking monitors, adjusting medications, documenting vital signs in careful handwriting that revealed nothing about the person holding the pen. At 7:45, she stood at the nurse's station and watched Emma through the open door of room 318. Colonel Mitchell had stepped into the hallway to take a call. Emma sat on the hospital bed in her pink dress with the white flowers, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the window where the morning light had turned gray. There was a quality to the child's stillness that spoke of someone who had learned that silence was safer than sound, that observation was safer than participation, that the smaller you made yourself, the less likely you were to be noticed by the things that had already hurt you. Megan recognized that particular geometry of pain. She recognized it because she had lived inside it for the last 18 years. She had been 26 years old when they pulled her out of Fallujah. She had been 28 when they told her senior chief petty officer Megan O'Brien officially did not exist anymore. She had been 29 when she had taken the nursing certificate they offered her and walked into Sacred Heart Hospital in San Diego as someone new, someone unnamed, someone whose past had been classified beyond even her own access. The combat boots sat in her locker. They were the only thing the government had let her keep. Emma's eyes moved slowly toward the doorway where Megan stood. For 3 seconds, perhaps 4, their gazes intersected. The child's eyes were the color of storm water. They held nothing, no recognition, no plea, no connection. But Megan saw something in them anyway, something that moved beneath the surface like the current in deep water, something that spoke in a language that had nothing to do with words. Then Colonel Mitchell's voice came from down the hall, and the moment fractured. Megan turned back to the medication cart and continued her work. She had learned long ago not to hold on to moments. She had learned to let them pass like water through open hands, leaving nothing behind except the memory of temperature, the ghost of touch, the knowledge that something had been there and was now gone. Dr. Sterling emerged from room 316, his residents trailing behind him. He paused at the nurse's station without acknowledging any of the women standing there. The Mitchell girl in 318. Has she shown any behavioral response? Any signs of engagement? One of the other nurses, Andrea, shook her head. She's been eating. Sleeping. No incidents. Pretty much silent the entire time. Precisely, Dr. Sterling said. There's nothing medically we can do for silence. Arrange the psych consult and move on. She'll either speak again or she won't. Not our department. He glanced at his watch, a Rolex that caught the fluorescent light and threw it back as a sharp silver flash. I have clinic in 30 minutes. I'll be back this afternoon. He left the unit without looking at any of the nurses directly. It was a skill he had perfected, the ability to be surrounded by people while remaining entirely alone in his own universe. As his footsteps faded down the corridor, Megan noticed that the fluorescent lights seemed to buzz a little louder, as if they had been holding their breath. Andrea turned to the medication cart. "You know, for a moment there I thought he was going to actually say something useful." Megan continued checking medications without answering. "I mean, come on," Andrea continued. "That kid has been through something that would destroy most adults. The father's sitting there with her every single day, and Sterling acts like the trauma isn't even worth acknowledging. Just psychiatric consult and move on. Like people are machines we can just reset." Megan's hands moved with practiced efficiency. 10 milligrams of morphine. 500 milligrams of amoxicillin. Measured drops in careful, precise amounts. The language of medicine was a language she spoke perfectly. "I tried to talk to Sterling about doing some nonverbal communication work with her," Andrea said. "You know, drawing, just being present, giving her options for expression that don't require words. And he completely shut me down. Told me to stick to nursing and leave the psychiatric assessments to physicians." The medication cart clicked shut. Megan turned and looked at Andrea for the first time that morning. Andrea was a good nurse, competent, compassionate, frustrated by the same systems that had broken 1,000 other people. She was also someone who had never worn combat boots, never performed an emergency pericardiocentesis on a child with a collapsed heart, never held a severed limb and tried to keep someone alive long enough for a helicopter to arrive. "Keep doing it," Megan said quietly. "The drawing. The presence. The nonverbal work." Andrea blinked. "He told me not to." "He's wrong." Megan's voice was level, conversational, empty of all inflection. "That little girl doesn't need a diagnosis. She needs someone to understand that silence isn't emptiness. It's just another language." She turned away before Andrea could respond and moved toward room 318. Through the open door, she could see Emma sitting exactly as she had been, hands folded, eyes fixed on the gray morning light coming through the window. Colonel Mitchell had returned to his chair beside her bed. He was reading a book, his hand resting on the bed rail beside his daughter's foot. Megan paused in the doorway for exactly 2 seconds. That was all it took. In that 2 seconds, she saw something in Emma's eyes shift, a minuscule rearrangement of focus, a barely perceptible acknowledgement that someone in the world understood the architecture of silence. Then she moved on to the next room, the next patient, the next measured moment in a hospital where Dr. Sterling believed himself the center of the universe and no one had yet understood that the actual center was standing at the medication cart, moving through the halls with invisible footsteps, wearing the weight of a rank and a service record that officially did not exist. The morning pressed forward. Rain began hammering against the windows like applause for a performance no one was watching. Rain hammered the windows of Emma's private room like distant artillery, and Megan stood at the foot of the bed with her hands folded carefully in front of her, a posture of deference, of someone accustomed to occupying the smallest possible space in rooms where she didn't belong. Colonel Mitchell sat in the vinyl chair beside his daughter, his dress uniform still crisp despite 2 days without leaving Sacred Heart's pediatric unit. Emma stared at nothing, a 7-year-old carved from silence, her small fingers picking at the hospital blanket's loose thread. Dr. Sterling swept in at 9:44 a.m. on morning rounds, his white coat starched enough to stand alone, followed by 2 residents who carried tablets and the careful posture of students learning how to extract value from human suffering. He didn't acknowledge Megan or the colonel. He addressed the child with the clinical detachment of a man discussing laboratory results. "Selective mutism," Sterling announced, positioning himself at the foot of the bed where he could be certain everyone saw him. "Traumatic onset, Baghdad incident 6 months prior. Prognosis guarded. Psychiatric consultation ordered. Medication management to follow." He turned a page on his tablet with the precision of a man closing a file. "Standard protocol from here forward." Megan had been a nurse at Sacred Heart for 8 months. Long enough to know the protocols. Long enough to know that protocols were designed by people who had never held a traumatized child's hand at 3 in the morning. She stepped forward, a small movement, barely noticeable, and her voice came out steady, carefully modulated to ask a question rather than suggest a challenge. Dr. Sterling, what if we tried nonverbal communication first? Drawing, music, tactile activities. Some trauma patients respond better to. Sterling stopped mid-turn. His eyes found her with the precision of a weapon finding a target, and something in his face shifted, a tightening around the mouth, a darkening behind the eyes. He laughed. Not the kind of laugh that suggested humor. The kind that suggested contempt being made audible. Stick to changing bedpans, O'Brien, he said, and the room's air pressure changed instantly. Colonel Mitchell's jaw clenched. The two residents exchanged glances, the kind of glances that would travel through the hospital's ecosystem like ripples in still water. And leave the psychiatric assessments to physicians who actually went to medical school. Emma's eyes didn't move from the wall. But her small hand gripped the blanket tighter. Megan took one measured breath through her nose. She could have argued. She could have cited research, statistics from trauma centers, studies on pediatric selective mutism outcomes. She could have raised her voice, defended herself, made a scene that would have cost her nothing but pride. Instead, she lifted her chin slightly, held Sterling's gaze for exactly 3 seconds, long enough for him to understand that she had heard him, that she had registered his contempt, and that she was choosing not to respond, and then she turned away without another word. Professional. Contained. The kind of composure that came from having learned, over 23 years and 4 months of military service, that reactions were currency better spent elsewhere. Sterling left at 10:03 a.m., satisfied. The residents followed in his orbit. The break room at 1:15 p.m. was a space Megan had learned to occupy carefully, a nurse's lounge designed for connection that became a minefield the moment you walked through its doors. She unwrapped her sandwich, turkey, mustard, the kind of lunch that existed because she had learned not to take time for complicated meals, and sat at the corner table near the window where rain continued its assault on San Diego's indifference. Jennifer arrived at 1:17, followed by Marcus. They didn't make eye contact with Megan. Instead, they exchanged a glance, brief, practiced, loaded with the kind of social coordination that meant the decision had already been made before they entered the room. They turned, walked toward a table across the room, pulled out chairs in unison, and sat with their backs to her. The new girl, whose name Megan still hadn't learned, paused for a moment, as if some instinct was pulling her toward the window table, toward the quiet nurse with the steady hands. Then Jennifer said something, too quiet to hear, and Marcus laughed the kind of laugh that was designed to be heard. The new girl sat down with them. Megan unwrapped her sandwich with careful, deliberate movements. Each motion precise. Each motion saying, "This doesn't affect me. This doesn't wound me. This doesn't land." She bit into the sandwich and looked out at San Diego, at a city that had no idea that a 7-year-old girl upstairs had lost her voice in a bombing that had erased 17 other people from the world, or that her father was standing in a hospital corridor wondering if silence was permanent, or that a former Navy SEAL was eating turkey and mustard while her former brothers and sisters were scattered across 3 continents. By 3:07 p.m., the write-up was on the board. Dr. Sterling had used the staff email system to post a formal notification on the pediatric unit's public bulletin board, the one where schedules were posted, where birthday announcements hung next to reminders about proper hand-washing technique, where everyone could see it. Megan read the words while restocking the medication cart 3 feet away, her hands moving with a kind of fluid precision that came from muscle memory, from a body that had been trained to function while the mind processed information that was trying to bury itself. RNM the Bryan cited for overstepping scope of practice and undermining physician authority during patient rounds. Further incidents will result in termination. 6 staff members read it while she stood there. She knew because she could hear them stop, feel the attention pause, sense the small moment of social confirmation that happened when a peer was officially marked as problematic. One of them, the respiratory therapist whose name was Davis, looked directly at her. Not with sympathy. With the careful neutrality of someone learning to distance themselves from a contagion. One tear escaped. It wasn't from sadness. It wasn't from hurt. It was the kind of tear that comes from the body's involuntary response to being catalogued, archived, marked for elimination. Megan wiped it away without changing her expression, without breaking eye contact with Dr. Sterling, who watched her from down the corridor with the satisfaction of a man who had successfully drawn blood. She didn't return to the medication cart. Instead, she walked directly toward him, and her voice when she spoke was so quiet that only Sterling could hear it. Controlled. Even. The kind of quiet that carried more weight than shouting ever could. That little girl deserves better than your ego. Then she walked past him, didn't wait for a response, didn't give him the opportunity to escalate, didn't offer him the satisfaction of having sparked a scene, and she returned to Emma's room, where the Colonel was reading a book he wasn't looking at, where his daughter was staring at nothing, where silence had taken up all the available space. Megan sat in the vinyl chair beside Emma's bed. She didn't speak. She reached out slowly, giving the child every opportunity to pull away, and she took Emma's small hand in hers. The girl's fingers were thin, fragile, the kind of small that made you understand what it meant for someone to be utterly defenseless. Megan didn't try to fix it. Didn't try to heal it. Didn't try to break through the wall of silence with her presence or her warmth or her intention. She just sat there. Her hand holding Emma's. The rain outside continuing its assault. The heart monitor beeping its steady rhythm. Time moving forward whether anyone was ready or not. Colonel Mitchell watched from across the room. His jaw unclenched. Just barely. He watched this nurse, this person his daughter's doctor had just publicly humiliated, choose to sit anyway. Choose to be present anyway. Choose to hold his child's hand anyway. He understood, without being told, that this woman had made a choice about who she was going to be in this moment. And that the choice cost her something. And that she had made it anyway. The afternoon dissolved into evening, and Megan didn't leave. She sat in that vinyl chair, Emma's hand in hers, while the hospital moved around them like water around a stone. The evening shift supervisor didn't stop her. By 11 p.m., Megan had moved through Sacred Heart's corridors like water finding its own level, unnoticed, necessary, invisible, which was exactly how she'd been trained to move through spaces that didn't want her there. She'd clocked out at 7, driven home to her studio apartment in Pacific Beach, stared at the combat boots beneath her locker, the physical evidence of a life that officially never existed, and then turned around and came back because some silences require witnesses. Emma was awake when she entered the room. The child sat propped against 3 pillows in the semi-dark, her small body outlined by the pale glow of the cardiac monitor. The girl's eyes tracked Megan's movement with the hypervigilance of someone who had learned that safety required constant surveillance. Megan pulled the vinyl chair close and sat without speaking. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm, 82 beats per minute, normal for a sleeping 7-year-old, though Emma was clearly not sleeping. "Can't rest," Megan whispered, making it a statement, not a question. "I know that feeling." Emma didn't respond. But her hand, resting on top of the hospital blanket, opened slightly, a gesture so small that a casual observer would have missed it entirely. Megan saw it the way she'd been trained to see things, every millimeter of movement carried information. She reached over and placed a piece of paper and a colored pencil on the bed table, then retreated to the corner chair. By morning, there were drawings. Simple renderings, a stick figure with yellow hair standing beside a stick figure with black hair. A box with wheels. A bird with wings spread wide. Emma hadn't spoken a word, not to Dr. Sterling during rounds, not to the day shift nurses, not to her father when Colonel Mitchell visited for the prescribed 20 minutes before returning to his hotel to sit alone with the weight of a child he couldn't reach. But she'd drawn. Each morning for 2 weeks, there were new drawings. A house with smoke coming from the windows. A helicopter. A hospital bed with a figure standing beside it. Megan came back every night. Not officially. The schedule rotation had moved her to pediatric oncology on the far west wing, Dr. Sterling's territorial move, executed during the afternoon shift meeting with the clinical precision of someone who understood that removing a problem from sight was almost as effective as removing it entirely. Megan had accepted the reassignment with a nod, changed her uniform, and walked to the oncology unit without complaint. But at 1 a.m., After the night charge nurse on Emma's wing, an older woman named Ruth with grey streaking through her hair and the kind of weariness that came from 30 years of watching doctors win and patients lose, spotted her entering through the stairwell and looked deliberately away. Megan knew the signal. It was safe to be unseen. The drawings accumulated on Emma's tray table. A hand reaching down. Water. Fire. A child's vocabulary of trauma expressed through colored pencil because the words lived somewhere behind the place in her throat that had locked itself shut 6 months ago in Baghdad. Dr. Sterling had begun his counteroffensive with the precision of a man protecting institutional territory. Megan had heard through the break room whispers that he'd made calls to the hospital credentialing committee, requesting a review of her unusual hiring circumstances and questionable references. He'd contacted the nursing director about her concerning pattern of boundary violations with patients. He'd requested that an outside behavioral health consultant review documented incidents of insubordination and scope creep. None of it was technically untrue, it was simply true the way a partial X-ray was true, showing one image while obscuring another. But Emma kept drawing. The monitors showed what the drawings didn't. By day 10 of Megan's unauthorized visits, the cardiac rhythm began to change. Emma's heart rate spiked to 120, 130 during the afternoon hours when anxiety typically peaked. Then it dropped inexplicably to 58 at night, a bradycardia that shouldn't have been present in a healthy 7-year-old. During morning rounds on day 13, Megan stood at the back of the room. She was still technically assigned to oncology, but she'd swapped shifts with another nurse to maintain the schedule, and watched Dr. Sterling review the overnight telemetry. Sinus tachycardia, he announced to the residents circling Emma's bed like apprentices waiting for wisdom. Anxiety-related, almost certainly. The child hasn't spoken in 6 months. Irregular eating patterns. Probable sleep disturbance. He tapped his pen against the chart. Continue current protocol. Pediatric psychiatry consultation remains outstanding. I'll follow up on that. The ICU bed is needed for actual critical cases. Colonel Mitchell stood on the far side of the bed, his uniform pressed with the kind of precision that suggested the military was the only place in his life where anything still made sense. His hands were clenched. The tendons stood out like piano strings. Her heart rate keeps dropping at night, Megan heard herself say. Her voice was quiet. Measured. The voice of someone who understood the rules of dominance and deference. Into the 50s. That's not typical anxiety presentation. That's. Your nursing assessment is noted, Dr. Sterling said without looking up. The tone was the one used for orderlies and custodial staff, the particular flatness that conveyed a hierarchy he needed everyone to understand. Residents, see the telemetry pattern? Classic anxiety-driven dysrhythmia. Nothing structural. Nothing requiring intervention beyond the psychiatric care we've already arranged. He turned to face Megan directly, and his expression carried the satisfaction of a man who'd already won before the battle started. Thank you for your observation, O'Brien. Please return to your assigned unit. She didn't flinch. That was the thing about being trained by people who'd survived Fallujah and Sanjin Valley, flinching wasn't in the vocabulary. Megan took one measured breath, held it for exactly 4 counts the way Lieutenant Commander Graves had taught her during combat stress inoculation in 2011, and then released it without visible change to her expression. Her hands remained at her sides. Her jaw didn't clench. The trembling wasn't fear, it was the physical manifestation of restraint, every muscle in her body trained by years of compartmentalization to keep the response contained where no one could see it. Understood, she said. She turned and walked toward the door. Colonel Mitchell's eyes followed her. She could feel the weight of his attention the way you feel pressure changes before a storm. But she didn't turn back. That afternoon, she received notice that she'd been reassigned again, this time to the critical care float pool, which was code for being removed from any consistent patient relationships. 3 different units across any given week. No continuity. No ability to build rapport or track patterns. It was institutional genius, the kind of separation that looked professional on a schedule and felt like exile when you were the one displaced. Megan signed the reassignment form and clipped it to the charge nurse's board without comment. But at 1:38 a.m., after the night shift had settled into the particular rhythm that hospital work developed at 2 a.m., skeleton crew, most patients sedated, the ER relatively quiet, she bypassed her assigned post in cardiac care and walked toward pediatrics with the same confident bearing she'd used moving through Baghdad neighborhoods where her presence needed to suggest official business and complete authorization. The night nurse was Ruth, the gray-haired woman with the 30-year tenure. She didn't look up as Megan passed the station. She simply turned her monitor away from the direct line of sight, a gesture so small it could have been mistaken for nothing at all. But in hospital culture, in any institutional culture where power moved vertically and oversight came from above, this was everything. It was permission masked as inattention. It was the quiet rebellion of people who understood that sometimes the rules protected the wrong people. Emma was awake again. The child sat in the semi-dark, the cardiac monitor casting its pale green glow across her face, and when Megan entered, she didn't flinch either. The girl simply extended her hand. Megan Saturday. She took the small hand, it was thin, the bones prominent like a bird's wing, and held it. She didn't speak. She didn't try to convince the child that everything would be okay, which was what untrained people did when they wanted to feel better about witnessing suffering they couldn't fix. She simply bore witness. She held the hand and watched the monitors. The rhythm was wrong. Even Megan could see it without being a cardiologist. The heart rate climbed from 88 to 122 in the space of 3 minutes. The waveform showed the kind of irregularity that came from a young heart pushed into dysrhythmia by trauma or structural issue. Emma's neck veins appeared distended. Megan could see the gentle bulge beneath the child's skin, the jugular venous pressure slightly elevated even at rest. This wasn't anxiety. This was something else entirely. She logged the observation in her mental database the way she'd been trained, not in writing, not where it could be documented and used against her, but in the deep organizational system of memory that operative training had developed. She would watch. She would collect data. She would wait for the moment when the pattern became undeniable, when the evidence accumulated to the point where even institutional hierarchy couldn't dismiss it. Emma's hand relaxed in hers. The child's breathing deepened. Sleep finally came at 3:12 a.m., and Megan sat in the corner chair watching the monitors climb and fall, watching the rhythm tell its silent story, and knowing that the worst part hadn't happened yet. It was coming. She could feel it the way a sailor feels a storm building at the horizon, not in the weather, not in any external indicator, but in the shift of pressure that comes before everything changes. And when it came, she would be ready. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what Dr. Sterling didn't know he'd just set in motion. The alarm screamed at 2:17 in the morning. Not the soft reminder chime of routine vitals. Not the gentle notification of a monitor reset. This was the full-throat wail of a heart monitor in distress, the sound that makes every nerve ending in a hospital stand up and salute. Megan was 3 floors down restocking supply carts, a task Sterling had reassigned her to, keeping her away from Emma, when she heard it pierce through the ventilation shafts. She didn't think. She moved. Her legs remembered the sprint through Phi Base Shanks corridors when mortar rounds started landing in the compound. Her lungs remembered the burn of running toward chaos instead of away from it. By the time she reached the pediatric unit, 2 nurses were already moving, but their movements had the quality of people trying to solve a puzzle they'd never seen before. Megan pushed through the door to Emma's room and saw immediately what the monitors were screaming about. The child's lips had turned the color of wet slate. Her neck veins bulged grotesquely, standing out like dark rope beneath her skin. Her chest rose in shallow, desperate gasps, the breathing of someone drowning while still technically breathing. The monitor showed a pattern called pulsus paradoxus, the pressure wave stuttering like a heart trying to pump through concrete. Cardiac tamponade. Fluid around the heart, compressing it with every beat, squeezing the life out of the organ with each microsecond that passed. Dr. Patel, the on-call resident, stood frozen in the doorway. His hands trembled at his sides. His eyes had the glassy quality of someone watching a nightmare play out on a screen he couldn't change. Megan had seen that look before, in the eyes of a 23-year-old corpsman during her second deployment, watching his first patient bleed out despite everything he tried. "Get a needle kit," Megan said. Not a request. A command that came from somewhere deeper than her nursing training, from a place where ranks meant something and hesitation meant body bags. Patel didn't move. She was already moving, already pulling the sterile kit from the crash cart, her hand steady as a surgical laser despite the alarm screaming in every direction. The kit contained a needle, 14-gauge angiocath, long enough to reach the pericardial sac, sharp enough to pierce the fibrous layer surrounding Emma's heart. Her fingers found the landmarks on the child's chest without conscious thought, the xiphoid process at the base of the sternum, the angle where the ribs met, the space where a needle could slip between chambers and reach the fluid without destroying everything in its path. Emma's eyes widened. Not in fear. In the wordless plea of a child who couldn't speak and was now suffocating, who had already survived one bombing and now her own body was becoming the bomb. Megan inserted the needle below the xiphoid process at a 45-degree angle, advancing slowly while her eyes tracked the monitor. The needle moved forward. Forward. Her hands remembered 1,000 traumas, a Marine with shrapnel in his abdomen, a Ranger with a sucking chest wound, a SEAL operator with a femoral artery severed by IED fragmentation. Her hands remembered what it meant when someone stopped breathing. Her hands had held lives together with nothing but gauze and will. The needle reached the pericardial sac. She pulled back on the plunger. Fluid appeared in the syringe. Not the clear or pale color of normal cardiac fluid. Dark. Thick. Blood-tinged. She withdrew it slowly, steadily, watching the monitor. 20 milliliters. 30. 40. Emma's breathing shifted, shallow gasps becoming slightly deeper. The monitor's pattern began to stabilize, the stuttering slowing, the rhythm finding its rhythm again. 50 milliliters. 60. Emma gasped. Her lips pinked. The oxygen saturation numbers on the monitor climbed, 84. 88. 92. The blue tint receded from her skin like a tide pulling away from shore. Her neck veins flattened. Her breathing deepened. The child's eyes found Megan's and for the first time in 6 months, Emma's hand reached out. Not in fear. In recognition. Her small fingers closed around Megan's wrist with the grip of someone who had just been pulled back from the edge of the void. Dr. Patel stared. His mouth opened and closed like a fish working oxygen from water. The two nurses stood motionless, understanding immediately what had just happened and what it meant, a procedure that required physician authorization, physician presence, physician signature on a dozen different forms had just been performed by a nurse in scrubs and combat boots that were sitting in a locker 2 floors down. Colonel Mitchell burst through the door, having heard the alarm from the waiting area where he'd been sleeping in a vinyl chair for the past 14 nights. His uniform was rumpled, his eyes red from exhaustion and hope and fear. He saw his daughter breathing, her color returning, her eyes open and aware. He didn't ask questions. He didn't ask who had done this. He simply stepped forward and placed his hand on Megan's shoulder with the grip of a man who understood exactly what had just been handed to him. "Thank you," he said quietly. Megan didn't respond. She was already documenting the procedure in her mind, the time, the fluid volume, the response, every detail that would either save her or condemn her. She already knew which way it would go. Dr. Sterling arrived at 6 o'clock in the morning wearing a suit that probably cost more than Megan's monthly salary. He carried the overnight report in his hand, his eyes moving across it with the precision of someone reading a contract he fully intended to weaponize. By 6:30, he was in a meeting with HR Director Margaret Voss, a woman who had never met Megan's eyes directly and who had 3 framed photos on her desk of a husband and 2 golden retrievers and absolutely no visible spine. By 8:30, Megan received the termination papers printed on hospital letterhead that gleamed white and official and final. Performed invasive procedure without physician supervision or authorization. Immediate dismissal. Sterling had signed it himself, his signature a slash of blue ink that looked like a knife wound across the page. He'd added a note in the margin, flagrant violation of scope of practice and patient safety protocols. Recommend review for potential criminal liability. Security guard Tom Watson appeared at 2 minutes past noon. He was a kind man, Megan had learned over her months at Sacred Heart. He brought coffee to the overnight crew and knew everyone's names and children's names and had a daughter himself who was studying to be a paramedic. He looked genuinely pained as he carried the cardboard box to her locker. Inside was her world. A cracked coffee mug with "World's Okayest Nurse" in fading letters, a gift from Emma's therapist that had lived on Megan's desk for 3 weeks. A dying succulent with brown-tipped leaves that someone had given her in the break room before the isolation began, their attempt at kindness before their survival instinct kicked in. And a photograph. The photograph. 22 faces arranged in 3 rows in front of a Quonset hut at FOB Shank, everyone in desert camouflage, everyone young, everyone alive. Her SEAL team. Charlie Platoon of SEAL Team 3, 2003. She could name every face. She could name the dates they died. Only 7 of the 22 were still breathing somewhere on Earth. She didn't look at Dr. Sterling as she left. She didn't speak to anyone. She simply carried the cardboard box down the corridor, past the nurse's station, past the pediatric unit where Emma was awake and breathing and alive, past the double doors that had been the entrance to a life that had never existed. The rain started as she reached the bus stop. Not gentle rain. Rain that hammered the pavement like applause or accusation, rain that blurred the faces in the photograph until they were just shapes, just ghosts, just brothers and sisters she'd been ordered to forget. She sat on the metal bench and watched the water stream down the laminated bus schedule, making the numbers illegible. 7 a.m. 8 a.m. 9 a.m. The times when buses came and went and carried people toward futures and away from pasts. She didn't move. The rain soaked through her scrubs, through the thin jacket Sterling had allowed her to keep. She sat holding the cardboard box and watching water blur the faces until they were only shadows. Somewhere in the hospital behind her, Emma was breathing. Dr. Sterling was winning. And the boots were still in her locker because in the moment between cardiac arrest and procedure, between saving a child's life and losing her career, she had simply forgotten. The hospital boardroom occupied the entire north wing of the administrative floor, all glass and mahogany and the kind of silence that comes from institutional power holding its breath. Chairman Whitmore sat at the head of the table, his hands folded with the precision of a man who'd spent 40 years making decisions that affected thousands. To his left, Dr. Chen, the chief medical officer, her reading glasses catching the fluorescent light. To her right, an FBI liaison named Drummond, his suit the color of storm clouds, his bearing suggesting he'd delivered worse news than this before. And across from them, Dr. Sterling, his tablet trembling in his hands like it weighed 1,000 pounds. "Your incident report," Whitmore said. Not a question. A statement with teeth. Sterling's fingers moved across the screen with the coordination of a man whose confidence was hemorrhaging in real time. The tablet glowed, casting his face in blue light that made him look cadaverous. He pulled up the documentation, the official record he'd filed at 6 in the morning on the day he'd had Megan escorted from the hospital, the day he'd sealed her out of the pediatric unit forever. His voice came thin and defensive. The report clearly states that RN O'Brien performed an emergency pericardiocentesis without physician authorization. The on-call resident, Dr. Patel, was present in the room and Dr. Chen leaned forward. Her eye scanned the tablet screen with the methodical precision of someone trained to spot inconsistencies. She'd read nursing notes for 30 years. She knew the difference between documentation that matched reality and documentation that served an agenda. This report states RN O'Brien performed the procedure over Dr. Patel's objection, she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of a jury returning a verdict. Dr. Patel sat 3 seats down, and his face went the color of old bone. That's not, his hands pressed flat on the mahogany table. She saved the patient's life. I froze. When the tamponade hit, when Emma's O2 sat dropped below 65 and her blood pressure was 70 systolic, I couldn't move. She gave me direct orders and I failed to assist. She was right. Every decision she made was clinically sound. The needle went in at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, exactly as it should have, and the fluid came out and the child's heartbeat stabilized and he looked at Sterling with something like revulsion. You told me she did it against my wishes. She saved my patient and I let you tell me I was the victim here. Sterling stammered, his words stumbling over each other like children fleeing a house fire. The resident was clearly in shock. His statement isn't reliable. He's confused about the sequence of events. Agent Drummond didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Men like him had learned long ago that quiet authority traveled further than noise. You falsified an official incident report resulting in the termination of a federal asset operating under protection protocols. The senior chief was conducting a classified assignment when you had her removed from the premises. That's a felony, Doctor. It's also treason. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum their electric song. The door at the back opened. Security guard Tom Watson stepped through, his uniform crisp, his expression the kind of neutral that masks deep professional satisfaction. In his hands was a cardboard box, white, standard issue, the kind used for personnel removals. He walked to Dr. Sterling's chair and placed the box on the table with the finality of a gavel striking wood. The contents were visible from where they'd been packed: Sterling's desk photographs, his diplomas in their frames, his nameplates and commendations, and all the physical evidence of a career spent climbing toward something he'd never possessed the character to hold. Dr. Sterling, Watson said, his voice measured and courteous in the way security personnel are trained to be when delivering mercy to the powerless, I believe you know the way out, sir. Sterling stood. His legs were unsteady, as if the bones had suddenly become negotiable. He walked past Chairman Whitmore, who didn't meet his eyes. He walked past Dr. Chen, whose expression had shifted from clinical curiosity to something colder and more final. He walked past Dr. Patel, who was staring at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. He walked past the FBI liaison, who was already making notes on his phone, calls being placed, protocols activated, the machinery of consequence grinding forward at speeds measured in government hours. And he walked past Megan. She stood at the periphery of the room, escorted back by Commander Rourke in his dress whites, his uniform carrying 3 silver stars and the kind of bearing that made the air pressure change. She'd been brought here not as a witness but as vindication. Her hands were steady. Her eyes tracked Sterling's exit with the detached observation of someone watching a laboratory specimen expire. She took one measured breath, held it for exactly 3 seconds, and said nothing. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was loaded, the kind of silence that lives in the space between truth and consequence, the kind that never forgets. The medical board opened an investigation into Sterling's treatment decisions for Emma that very afternoon. The misdiagnosis. The dismissed symptoms of pericardial effusion hidden inside a presentation of anxiety. The reassignment of competent staff who might have caught what he'd overlooked. The state licensing board received a formal complaint within 24 hours, filed by the hospital's legal department and copied to 3 federal agencies. Within 48 hours, his medical license was suspended pending review. Within 10 days, it was revoked. 6 months passed like pages turning in a book written in advance. Megan worked as Sacred Heart's Director of Trauma Services now, an office on the 4th floor with windows that faced east toward the morning sun and a locked drawer containing commendations she'd never asked for and never displayed. The combat boots sat on her office shelf, laces tied together in the way soldiers tie them for the final time before a ceremony, before a transition, before something ends and something else begins. They were no longer hidden. They were no longer the evidence of a life that officially never existed. They were monuments to the silence that sometimes saves people, and the voice that sometimes has to break it. Emma visited on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, walking through the hospital corridors with the lightness of a child who'd been returned to the world. She spoke in full sentences now, paragraphs, entire conversations that wound through topics like a child's mind naturally wins, birds and trees and whether Megan preferred chocolate or vanilla, whether the clouds looked like anything today, whether the beating of a heart was the same as the beat of a drum. Her father accompanied her, Colonel Mitchell in his service dress blues, carrying coffee and sitting in the chair across from Megan's desk, watching his daughter heal with the kind of attention that only comes from having stood at the edge of loss and been pulled back. Ruth, the night charge nurse who'd moved files between shifts and averted her eyes when Sterling had entered rooms, Ruth stopped by one afternoon with a stack of patient charts, lingering in the doorway. I always knew there was something special about you, she said quietly, meeting Megan's eyes for the first time with something like apology. I should have said something sooner. Megan nodded. You did what you could. Jennifer and Marcus, the nurses who'd abandoned her in the break room, avoided eye contact in the corridors. Guilt moves differently than respect. It slinks, it retreats, it makes the guilty smaller. Megan noticed, and then she stopped noticing, because holding on to anger was a weight she'd already carried for 22 years and she was done with the burden. On a Tuesday afternoon in late August, Colonel Mitchell mentioned an encounter at the strip mall off Highway 163, the sprawling outdoor complex of discount retailers and fast food chains where most people avoided eye contact and moved with purpose. Dr. Sterling was there, sitting at a folding table beneath a sun-faded banner that read affordable supplemental insurance, his tie loosened in the San Diego heat, trying to make eye contact with passing shoppers who looked away, who quickened their pace, who had somewhere more important to be. His medical license had been revoked after the board found 3 other falsified reports stretching back for years, 2 misdiagnoses he'd blamed on nursing staff, evidence of a pattern rather than a mistake, evidence of character rather than circumstance. Megan listened to this without satisfaction. Not even a small corner of it. She felt only sadness for talent corrupted by ego, for a man who'd had everything required to help people and had chosen instead to protect himself, and in protecting himself had lost everything. That was the real tragedy, not that he was punished, but that his punishment had been inevitable, predictable, the exact consequence of exact choices. Emma drew a picture that afternoon, her colored pencils moving with the precision of a child who'd learned how to process trauma through creation. A phoenix rising from flames, orange and gold and red, wings spread wide, ascending. She handed it to Megan without explanation, the way children offer gifts, as simple statements of feeling that need no translation. Megan pinned it on her wall beside her commendations, beside the photograph of her SEAL team, beside the life that had finally, after 2 decades, been allowed to exist in daylight. Emma read the poster that Megan had hung near her desk, small letters in a clean font, not all heroes wear capes, some wear scrubs. The child smiled. That's you, she said. Megan's hands didn't tremble. They hadn't trembled in 6 months, and they wouldn't tremble again. They were the hands of a woman who'd survived Baghdad and bureaucracy, who'd chosen a child's life over her own safety, whose refusal to abandon her mission had cracked open a system built to protect the powerful. Megan placed her hand on top of Emma's small one, steady as a surgical laser, steady as bone. That's all of us, she said. If you've made it this far, you understand what happens when an institution tries to silence the truth. One person's refusal to look away, to shut up, to accept injustice as inevitable, that's all it takes. That's everything. Subscribe. Like. Comment with your own story of someone who refused to abandon their mission when the world told them to give up.